Hip-hop artist Chinx was on the brink of major stardom when he was shot and killed in 2015. Now, more than 2.5 years later, the NYPD has made 2 arrests. So is this really the end of the story or just the beginning?
It was shocking, overwhelming, to say the least. You know, we've been waiting for this day for 2.5 years, so it's like, for them to, they actually came and knocked on my door at 9 o'clock in the morning to tell me that they had made an arrest. So it was, I was literally shaking.
Our Fox 5 camera was the only one on hand as NYPD detectives brought in 32-year-old Quincy Homere and arrested him for the murder of Chinx on May 15, 2015 in Queens when his Porsche was stopped at a light.
Quincy, why did you do it?
Minutes later, they brought in suspect number 2, 26-year-old Jamar Hill. He was also charged with murder.
What do you say to his kids?
For over 2.5 years, NYPD detectives were relentless in their search for the killers, no matter what the obstacles, says Queens South Homicide Lt. Richard Rudolph.
They ran into countless dead ends, and we followed countless leads that essentially led to nowhere. It was just because they kept digging and digging and digging and never quit that they were able to build a case against us.
Janelli tells me that during the many months when it seemed like nothing was going on, detectives from the 107th Precinct and Queens South Homicide kept her informed privately.
You want to satisfy the people's mind and let them know that this is what we have, this is what we're looking at. But then it's like, you know that any little thing that gets out can jeopardize everything. So you're kind of just sitting on it and just letting them do their job.
For Chinx's legion of fans in the hip-hop culture, long accustomed to unsolved rapper murders, the arrest came as a shock, says the editor-in-chief of XXL magazine, Vanessa Satten.
For the most part, with the murders we've had over the past 30 years of rappers, I think there have been 60 plus. Most of them haven't gotten solved.
Lieutenant Rudolph says in 2009, suspect Quincy Homere and Chinx had a beef over a gang-controlled phone on Rikers Island that left Homere seething. In between felony arrests, Homere tried his hand at rap under the name Quality and even had a song out called IDK Nothing, with a reference to the same type of gun allegedly used in Chinx's murder. On April 24, 2015, after a show at the Soundgarden Hall in Philadelphia, where rising star Chinx was performing with French Montana, Homere's hate and jealousy ignited. Sources say Chinx called him out as a snitch, and for the next 3 weeks, law enforcement sources say, Homere hunted Chinx like an animal. Criminal defense attorney Kenneth J. Montgomery says investigators did their homework.
For them to go back to a time where these 2 gentlemen were on Rikers Island and develop a case or a motive based on that's obviously they know more about these defendants than they're telling.
The courtroom was packed with Chinx family and friends, and security was tight as Homere and Hill were brought before a judge. They were arraigned on murder and other charges and pleaded not guilty. It was the first time Janelli saw the men who allegedly took away the love of her life and father of their children.
It was the hardest thing I ever had to do. I mean, literally, they brought them in from behind us, so they had to walk right past us. And just knowing that the room is full of officers, there's like absolutely, they already knew what to expect, so they were prepared.
It's still too early to tell whether the suspects will go to trial or take a plea, but Janelli says she'll be in court every time.
I will be at every single court date with whoever else wants to attend. I mean, all the support that we can get to show that we are fighting the fight and we're going to do this to the very end.
This high-profile case has repercussions for Chinx's family, for hip-hop, and beyond. Let's find out what our panel has to say. Joining me is Vanessa Satten. She's editor-in-chief of XXL magazine. She was the first female editor of XXL, and she's interviewed many of the biggest names in hip-hop. V, great to have you with us.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Also with us is Dr. Darren Porcher. He's a criminal justice professor, former NYPD lieutenant, and security consultant for major hip-hop artists. Darren, great to have you.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Also with us is Kenneth J. Montgomery. He's a federal and state criminal defense attorney, a law professor at Fordham University, and a former prosecutor. Ken, great to have you with us.
Thank you,
Vanessa, I want to start with you on this. How surprised were you to hear news of the arrest, and how surprised was the community?
I was very surprised to hear. I think the community was. Speaking to a few people within the community or on the legal side of things, I think that they weren't so surprised, definitely. But us in the media and I think more of the hip-hop culture were surprised. I think it's about 60-plus rappers have been killed over the last 30 years or murdered, killed, and most of them are unsolved. The biggest ones, Tupac and Biggie, J Master J, being in the state that they are, I think leads people in a lot of ways to believe that rappers' murders don't get solved and just kind of chalk it up to it is what it is. So I think people didn't really think Chinx's would and didn't stop thinking about him, but stopped probably thinking about the actual murder and who did it or it being solved. So I do think this came from left field for people who are fans and in the media side and who weren't probably working on it on a day-to-day basis for the past 2.5 years. And I wouldn't say it's a pleasant surprise because there's nothing pleasant about the situation, but it's definitely everybody was happy that it was solved and that
to see some movement
to see
in
some
it,
movement,
really.
exactly, that it wasn't forgotten, because we pay tribute to the rappers over and over after they pass, but sometimes the case not being solved, doesn't celebrate the legacy in the same way.
Exactly. Ken Montgomery, were you surprised that these arrests happened? Because some people said, oh, this came out of left field, but it turns out there was a grand jury hearing evidence for many months.
No, it's a homicide. There's no statute of limitations on a homicide. So no, I wasn't surprised. And also, when you look a little bit closely at the case, one of the defendants has a federal case. Often in these types of cases, the federal government has a tremendous amount of resources, and that's from the law enforcement side. That's also from the intelligence side. They work hand in hand sometimes with state prosecutors to bring forth an investigation that may have been cold. So I don't think it would happen out of nowhere by any means.
Darren, in terms of the police investigation, because there were certain problems with this case from day one that made it difficult for the police to solve, and it was the 107th Precinct in Queens, Queens South Homicide Division that did it. But what were the aspects of this case that just made it unlike any other?
Well, we have this rule, I shouldn't say a rule, but this is something that fits into the social constructs in many of these communities, no snitching, so to speak. And so that in many ways hindered the police's ability to move forward with this. But when we look at a lot of the nuances in policing and technological advancements, they were able to do something we refer to as dumping a cell phone tower. And that allowed the police to get that information, because whenever you use a cell phone, it bounces off of a cell phone tower. And oftentimes, it's a very difficult and arduous task to dump a cell phone tower because you have thousands of calls that go through. However, when we look at the time of day that this happened, early morning, you didn't have that overwhelmingly large number of calls.
It wasn't like rush hour or the morning, in the middle of the day when
that assisted law enforcement tremendously, and an attribute to what Mr. Montgomery stated in terms of how these federal prosecutors work. They have an enormous amount of resources coupled with they have time. There's a lot of time.
Like Ken said, there's no statute of limitations.
Right, there's no rush to get into this, but it just goes back to the combination of dumping the cell phone tower and just looking at who actually came up on the cell phone tower. Then they started to target a certain population.
And there's a lot more technology
and that's how they came
now.
up with the individual.
Right, there's a lot more technology available.
And like was just stated, what you also can't underestimate, the feds, there is cliche no snitching, but it's snitching all in the community. The thing is to get those people to come forward and go into a grand jury.
And you're talking about when they're facing heavy charges, they go like, I need a break.
What I'm saying is that it would not surprise me if the federal government got wind as to what happened and gave that information to state prosecutors.
Okay, this is Street Soldiers. I'm your host, Lisa Evers. We'll be back right after this.
There are killers, people who are very well respected in the street, who everyone knows that they cooperated with the government.
Vanessa, in terms of the culture in hip-hop, it's been called the hip-hop code of silence. And, behind the scenes, some of the investigators that I've been talking to over the last couple of years said nobody from hip-hop really knew or really wanted to speak to the police. They said absolutely nothing. Why do you think that is?
I just think the code of silence for years in hip-hop, the mentality is you don't snitch. what that really means in a certain level of when your life's threatened. So I'm sure that people break, and I'm sure that's really not a complete code of silence that everybody lives by. But the mentality overall in hip hop is that you don't snitch over the years. It's gone on and on for years. Snitches get stitches. Da da da. You know, there's been jokes about it all the time, and I think that plays a role in where people get confused of what their role is in the community when crime happens, when stuff happens, because the snitching rule doesn't necessarily pertain to everybody who listens to hip hop, but a lot of people embrace it that way also in the community as well. And I think that gives, from our research, reporting, gives cops in New York and everywhere a hard time on how to solve these crimes when people feel like they can't say anything that they've seen.
Ken, what about that in terms of this no snitching code?
I think
and the hip hop code.
I think
silence.
It sounds great, but if that was,
is that a myth? Is this a street myth?
I think it's a street myth, because if it was in fact true, then the federal government and U.S. attorneys wouldn't be so successful. They wouldn't have a 90+% rate in trials. And
explain that to
meaning
us.
that the federal system is based on information, confidential informant.
Right,
and
so
many of the state cases that go to trial are based on someone testifying. So I think it sounds great, but I don't think that's what's really going on.
So basically, if somebody gets caught, that somebody already has a charge for something else, or they have violated their parole, or they have other criminal justice issues on their record, they get arrested again, and then in order to get a reduced sentence or to get some kind of favor,
sometimes
they turn informant. Is that how it works?
Sometimes they make statements to someone who they tell those statements. Sometimes they go on their phone and their technology and they make admissions or confessions. It comes from all types of scenarios.
But it could hurt your reputation.
It could.
Right.
That's the bizarre thing.
And people find out about it.
But let's be clear about this. See, this is what we don't talk about.
Well, let's talk about it.
From this city and from all these urban cities, there are killers, people who are very well respected in the street, who everyone knows that they cooperated with the government, and they come home and everybody is fine with it because that person has a violent history to
so nobody's going to mess with them.
So nobody's going to say anything to
But
them.
in hip hop, it's different. If you're an artist and you're seen talking to cops.
That's different. But it's...
Why is that, Darren?
What Mr. Montgomery is referring to is something we refer to as a proffer agreement in law enforcement, where you have people that come in, someone that was arrested for something, and they say, hey, look, like you mentioned, hey, look, you know what, I'm trying to work this off, this is what happened. Now, that does happen, but I'll tell you just personally, that's not, like he mentioned 90%, that's not what my experience has been as an NYPD detective. A lot of the people that I've brought in were not as willing to give that information. And as she mentioned, that if your label is a snitch, it can have tremendous consequences on who you are as an individual. And it goes back to the Chinx situation. Chinx had stated that this person, Quincy, had snitched on him on Rikers Island. And it put a fatwa
Well, he said
over
he's a snitch, but they could have referred to something else that we don't even know about
once again,
yet.
you said he said he was a snitch.
Right.
But that put that black cloud over
that
Quincy.
label in itself
That being
shut
said,
him down.
That being said, it haunted him, and he felt that he needed a sense of retribution, and that's why he got back at Chinx. But from my understanding, it was because Chinx and him got into a physical altercation on Rikers Island, and Chinx appeared to be the victor in this, and that individual Quincy stated
Quincy
that
had a minor face injury,
he did this to me, and he told the COs he did this to me,
and you're supposed to say I fell down or I walked into a wall.
That was the situation behind it.
Vanessa, in terms of the hip-hop culture, so we go to April 24th, 2015, in this back room at the Soundgarden, which I've seen pictures of. There's Chinx is there, French is there, there's a bunch of Uncle Murder's there, there's different rappers, there's Quincy is there, and then this is where Chinx allegedly said, don't mess with that guy, because he was trying to get on, and he was trying to be Quincy, the accused shooter, was also trying to be a rapper himself under the name Quality. He said, don't mess with this guy, he's a snitch. So at that point, in front of that kind of crowd, in front of that kind of a group in a private setting, is that like the kiss of death?
It definitely didn't
career?
look good for him. I don't know if it's the kiss of death because we don't know the exact story of what Chinx was claiming he was a snitch over.
But is that enough to make Quincy super mad enough to just?
I think it's enough to make him mad. I don't know if it's enough to kill anybody. Right. What we're talking here, but I think it's definitely enough for him to not like him.
But it goes back to the street code.
It's the street code, and also what I'm confused by, which I don't know, is between between 2009 and 2015, how much antagonizing was going back and forth between the two. You know, you talk about the incident that you just mentioned. We talk about the incident in jail, but I don't know, and we weren't documenting it because we didn't really understand the beef between these two men, is what was really going on between 2009 and 2015 to build Quincy's rage up to that point. I would ignorantly think it wasn't just saying one thing off of stage, that there would be more to it.
That might have been the trigger or the spark, right?
Could have been the trigger, could have been the straw, could have been, but whatever it is, it seems like I would guess that there would be more going, or more that happened between 2009 and 2015 besides that one night, or you would hope, I guess. I'll
tell you, that street code, you being labeled as a snitch is a big thing. That's a tough rock to get from under. So it could have just been that one thing. And it could have been that hatred, and that vitriolic relationship became more and more vehement and more prevalent. And it subsequently caused Quincy to be suppressed as him trying to emerge as a new and up-and-coming artist. Because other people in the hip hop community will feel the same way. This guy's a snitch. I'm not messing with him.
This was a crime fueled by hate, which is a very big topic in hip hop, jealousy, where Quincy Homere comes out, you know, he gets out of Rikers Island eventually.
Oh, yeah.
And respect, and he's trying to get his own rap career going in between catching these felony cases that he had going on, and he sees Chinx really starting to blow up. Turns on the radio. He's on Hot 97 every couple minutes. He sees
the Kardashian family on reality shows. It's a whole different level of success.
Types of things. Explain to our audience this whole thing about hate and where that comes from.
I think hate and jealousy mixed together. So I think if this is the case of what happened, I think there had to be an element of jealousy mixed in. You know, was he being blocked? Was Quincy being blocked from hip hop community? How much did he feel like he was being blocked or stopped from being famous? You know, that goes back to, I'm curious again, between 2009 and 2015, exactly what happened. Is it years of him feeling like he was being cut out of the industry, or was it that one night? I think that would determine a lot of how much hate built up as well. But I think we're talking about a mix of hate and jealousy together. If the story looks like how it's kind of unfolding, that there was one man who was jealous of another and felt that he was keeping him out of it, and they had a pre-existing problem. We haven't seen that happen many, many times, but I guess it's not unheard of. I guess, you know, we've seen a lot of people be jealous and let it out the wrong way. But I still think it's very early to know the extent of what really was going on between them on a public level. I'm sure the police know a lot more, but as far as us knowing, you know, the community and the media knowing exactly what the details are, I'd assume based on, as the case unfolds, if it turns into a trial, we get a better idea.
We're going to see what happens.
That's a tip-off, though.
Yeah.
That's a narrative.
What?
That this was hate and jealousy, that's a narrative.
What does that mean?
That means that there's a story behind this.
Right.
You think there's more to the story?
But what I'm saying is, for NYPD to put that narrative,
right?
That narrative has to be supported by some information.
That we don't have yet.
That type of personal information is coming from possibly inside one of the shooters' camp or circle or environment. Whether it's jail, whether it's whoever you were running with, or whatever. That's a personal narrative. Jealousy and hate.
Right.
So how do you know that? Where's that information come from?
Which goes back to Vanessa's point about 2009 to 2015.
Yeah, because ultimately that story is going to have to be distributed in a court through motive and through theory. So for them to put that out there, that means that there's some information
there's definitely
that we
a lot more to this.
Know about. Yeah.
We're going to stay on this case. We've been on the Chinx case since day one, and much more to come, I'm sure. So I want to thank all of our guests for being with us for this episode of Street Soldiers. Vanessa Satten, Dr. Darren Porcher, and also Kenneth J. Montgomery. Thank you all so much for being with us for this episode of Street Soldiers. And remember, use your mind. It's your best weapon. I hope it's your only weapon. I'm Lisa Evers. Let's push for peace.